Hey there and welcome back. This time we're talking about Kashtira. As usual, we'll cover the archetype as a whole, each of the cards and how they all interact, the strengths, the weaknesses, and of course, some other cards to pair with it. This time, however, we'll also go a little more in depth than usual on some cards and strategies that are strong against the archetype, because at first, these cards are probably going to sound absolutely insane, but I promise there are very clear and exploitable weaknesses in both its defense and offense, and we'll spend a little extra time on that. Also, this video took a bit too long to make, and in that time a ban list did come out that affected the archetype. The major hits are on screen now, but I'll cut in once or twice more during the video where it's appropriate, including a summary at the end of my thoughts on the ban list and how it affected the deck. But real quick before we get started, if you like this video and want to see more like it, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe, and maybe even let me know what you think down in the comments. But now let's get into it. Kashtira is a powerful rank 7 archetype combining two major forms of offense. First, they can mostly reactively banish the opponent's cards face down, including ones they don't even have access to yet. And second is the powerful but seldom seen ability to lock out your opponent's empty zones. Not just monster zones, but spell and trap zones too. Debuting in Darkwing Blast and getting a second wave of support in Photon Hypernova, Kashtira is the third archetype in the story of Visas Starfrost, and at a high level, it's a combo deck that wants to lock out the opponent's zones, limit the options they can respond with, and then banish whatever they're able to set up with the remaining zones. It accomplishes this with a number of level 7 psychic-type monsters with varying attributes, and one level 4 warrior, and all of them have some way of special summoning themselves, and some form of banishing cards. Some of them banish your opponent's cards from various places, while others banish your own cards, and of course it has ways to generate advantage from this. The special summoning means that it also excels at pumping out generic rank 7 monsters since it never locks you into the archetype. It also only has 2 extra deck monsters, one of which will lock zones when your opponent's cards get banished face down, and the other is a Macrocosmos on legs that can proactively banish your opponent's cards face down, unlike most of the main deck monsters. Alright, now we're ready to get into the cards. And just so I don't have to say it every time, just assume that each effect is a hard once per turn. There are a few very specific effects that aren't, and the fact that they aren't is super important to how that effect is supposed to operate within the archetype, so we'll talk about those in a lot more depth when we get to them. First up, we have the original 3 main deck monsters, and they all work very similarly. They're all level 7 psychic monsters with different attributes, and they share the effect that you can special summon them for free as long as you control no monsters. And that effect isn't a once per turn, so whatever you do, don't waste your compulse-like effects on these if it's the only monster they control. Also, they all have an ignition effect to search a different type of Kashtira card from the deck, and finally, they all have an effect that triggers either when they declare an attack or if your opponent activates a monster effect. All of these trigger effects will face down banish something of your opponent's, but they differ on where they can banish cards from. And we'll talk more about this later, but most importantly, those banish effects aren't quick effects, they're trigger effects, so you can't chain it to your opponent activating a monster effect. You have to wait for that chain to resolve, and then you can activate them. Kashtira Fenrir is an earth monster with both an attack and defense of 2400. Fenrir is the one that can search a Kashtira monster, and its trigger effect simply lets you target a face-up card your opponent controls and banish it face down. Fenrir is generally going to be the strongest of the 3, at least as far as general usability and immediate payoff go. Like, it's not going to be the one you most want to open, but if for some reason you had to pick exactly one of them to be your entire end board, it would probably be Fenrir. And it's also the one you're most likely to see pop up in another deck as a tech option for extra removal, because it's pretty much always good to banish a card from your opponent's field face down. Also, unlike most cards like this, Fenrir's search effect can actually grab another copy of itself. Near release, it often got called the next Pankratops or even a better Pankratops sometimes, and you can see the similarities. Both special summon themselves and get rid of an opponent's card. Plus, this one can search another copy of itself for follow-up, and the summon isn't even hard once per turn like Pankratops, which is great. But the fact that the removal isn't a quick effect is actually a huge weakness, and Pankratops can still be summoned if you control another monster, so it's not quite as simple as just saying it's better. Next, we have Kashtira Unicorn. It's a wind monster with 2500 attack and 2100 defense. Unicorn is the Kashtira spell searcher, and its trigger effect lets you look at your opponent's entire extra deck and banish a card from it face down. Unicorn is probably the most annoying of the 3. Its banish effect can be way more devastating than Fenrir's, but a lot of decks can pivot after losing a specific extra deck monster. Fewer can recover from losing board presence after committing their normal summon. Also, technically, you can counter it all the way back at the deck building stage by just playing an extra copy of any super important cards. After we look at the spells, we'll also see that Unicorn is definitely the best one to open. It's basically full combo from just Unicorn and any other monster because some of the spells are so good. Kashtira Ogre is a water monster with 2800 attack and 1000 defense. Ogre is of course the trap searcher, and its trigger effect lets you excavate the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, banish one face down, then return the rest to the top of the deck in their original order. Honestly, this is the worst of the original 3. The banish effect isn't necessarily bad, but it's not nearly as good as the other 2. Also, spoiler alert, but the trap lineup isn't going to be nearly as good as the spell or monster lineup. That said, it does have the most attack of any of the main deck Kashtira monsters, and sometimes what you need is a monster to summon to run something over before you start your plays, or even just a tiny bit more damage to close a game out. Also, one of the traps is decent, so I wouldn't count Ogre out entirely. The next monster is this archetype's Visas Starfrost counterpart, Kashtira Riseheart. It's a level 4 fire warrior with, of course, 1500 attack and 2100 defense. If you control a Kashtira monster, you can special summon it from your hand. Also, your extra deck is then locked into only X these monsters for the rest of the turn. But it's not for the entire turn, so you can still do other things first. Also worth noting that unlike the first 3 monsters, this special summon is an activated effect, so your opponent can respond before this hits the board. Also, during your main phase of the turn it was normal or special summoned, you can banish 1 Kashtira card from your deck as cost, other than another copy of itself, to then banish the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck face down, and if you do, Raidraptor's level becomes 7. This effect makes Raidraptor an excellent extender, having the opposite special summon condition as the original 3, and being low level so it's easy to normal summon, then level modulate if you get stuck in a weird spot. Also, we'll see later, but being able to banish any other Kashtira card from your deck as cost is actually insane. Not only do we have some back row cards with effects that trigger if they're banished, but we also have some ways of getting our banished cards back straight to the field, so we'll see how to optimally incorporate Raidraptor into the combos, and the best targets for banishing later. The last 2 main deck monsters are also level 7 psychics, and they come as a result of the story tie-ins with other archetypes. As a result of the Kashtira's actions, Tearlament's Kitkalos and the 3-headed beast from Scareclaw Triheart have become Tearlament's Kashtira and Scareclaw Kashtira respectively, and both of them have effects that fit thematically with both of their archetypes. Tearlament's Kashtira is a water attribute with 2300 attack and 1200 defense, the same stats as Kitkalos. Its effect says that during the main phase, as a quick effect, you can special summon it from your hand, and if you do, banish 1 Kashtira or Tearlament's monster from your hand or graveyard. Also, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can mill the top 3 cards of either player's deck. And finally, if it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can mill the top 2 cards of your own deck. So in total, Tearlament's Kashtira can mill the same number of cards as Kitkalos, but also has the option to go aggro and use some of those mills on your opponent instead. Also, its other effect is a sort of inverted Kitkalos effect, where instead of sending itself to the graveyard to summon another one, it banishes another one to summon itself. Scareclaw Kashtira is an earth monster with 0 attack and 2600 defense, and just like the last one, during the main phase as a quick effect, you can special summon it, and if you do, banish a Kashtira or Scareclaw monster from your hand or graveyard. Also, this card can attack while in face-up defense position, and if it does, apply its defense for damage calculation. And finally, if your Kashtira or Scareclaw monster battles an opponent's monster, that opponent's monster's effects are negated until the end of the turn. So it has some nice synergy with Triheart, who switches all monsters to defense position, and since it can attack in defense position, it's a really nice in-archetype way of dealing with things like Baguska. But that non-targeting effect negation is super nasty. It's not just when you declare an attack, it's any battle. So if your opponent attacks one of your Scareclaws or Kashtiras, that monster's effects are negated till the end of the turn. Also, the effect negation is immediate on attack declaration, so it stops things like Elshal Construct from destroying your monster, and it can even turn off built-in battle protection. Of course, it'll also turn off built-in targeting protection, meaning you can have Fenrir declare an attack on a monster that can't be targeted with effects, then its effects, including its targeting protection, are immediately negated, so now you can activate Fenrir to target and banish it face down. Then, since the number of monsters on the field changed, you can replay the attack, negating a second monster's effects. This non-targeting negation comboed with Fenrir is probably going to be the best in-archetype way of dealing with something like a Dragoon. Alright, now it's time for the extra deck. First up is Kashtira Shangri-Ira. It's another fire monster with 0 attack and 3000 defense, and it's a rank 7 and requires 2 or more level 7 monsters as material. First, during each standby phase, you can special summon a Kashtira monster from your deck. Now this next effect is one of those important effects we mentioned earlier that isn't a once per turn. Each time a card or cards your opponent owns and possesses is banished face down, except during the damage step, you can choose one unused main monster zone or spell or trap zone, and it cannot be used while this monster is face up on the field. And finally, if this card on the field would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can detach a material from it instead. This is kinda wild. The idea here is obviously that since you have all these face down banish effects on your other monsters, you can lock a few of your opponent's zones and make them need to play with fewer resources to break through. And this would be kept balanced by the fact that those other effects are hard once per turns, and they're almost all reactive trigger effects, so your opponent at least gets to try something before all their zones start to disappear. Unfortunately, between the fact that nowhere on Shangri-Ira does it say you can only control one, and the existence of a certain rank 7 prize card that this archetype obviously took inspiration from that can actively face down banish your opponent's cards from outside the field in 2 different ways, this card becomes absolutely insane. You've probably seen images from the first YCS after these cards became legal, but it's actually possible to lock out 9 of your opponent's zones when you're going first. It is technically still possible after the ban list, it's just way more difficult to set up, and it relies on way more of the trigger effects, so you have a lot less control over it, and your opponent kinda has to knowingly walk into it. But don't worry, later we will talk about how to counter that strategy, and how to do it if you've decided you hate your opponent. On top of that, even if its effects are negated, the opponent doesn't get their zones back, because the zone locking is not a continuous effect, it's just a trigger effect that is fully resolved, and the opportunity to stop it has already passed. Of course, if Shangri-Ira's effects are negated, it can't continue to lock zones, so something like an Impermon at turn 1 when you're going second isn't the worst idea in the world, but realistically you should probably be saving it for Diablosis, that rank 7 prize card we mentioned, and we'll talk about more later, because if they're going for the 9 zone lock, that's the card that's going to be triggering 4 of them, so you'll get more value out of the imperm by stopping that card. But either way, being able to stop yourself from losing 5 zones on turn 1 does guarantee that you'll have at least one of each type of zone when it comes to your turn, so no matter what cards you open to break through their board, you'll be able to use them. Also, it may have already raised this red flag for you, but it'll lock a zone anytime one of its opponent's cards is banished face down, so if you're playing against it, you should be really careful about using cards that banish your own cards face down, namely a lot of the pot cards, and especially Small World, because that one banishes 2 of your own cards face down, and those banishes are separated by a then clause, so technically they happen at 2 different times, so Shangri-Ira will get to lock 2 zones off of it. And finally, we have Kashtira, a Rise Heart. This one is a Dark Machine rank 7 with both an attack and defense of 3000, and requires 3 level 7 monsters as material. But once per turn, you can also Xyz summon a Rise Heart using just a single Kashtira monster as material if an effect of Shangri-Ira was successfully activated that turn. And of course, if you use an Xyz monster for this, you transfer its materials. Now, this works for any of Shangri-Ira's activated effects, so either the special summon or the zone lock, but not the destruction protection. It also doesn't say this has to be your Shangri-Ira, so in the mirror match, you could get some good utility out of this. But realistically, a Kashtira player who's going first is going to get to see the other player's extra deck, so nobody should be falling into this trap. Also, it has another effect that says any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead, so it's a macrocosmos on very big, very easy to summon legs. Next, once per chain, each time a card or cards is banished, attach one banished card to this card as material. That's any banish, not just a face down banish. And finally, as a quick effect, you can detach 3 materials from this card, then target one card on the field and banish it face down. The attaching cards to it is obviously nice for getting more ammo for the banish effect, but it can also be good for hiding your opponent's resources from them. If they have an important card that they need to recycle and they're only playing 1 copy, you can really hurt them. But we should point out that this attaching effect is mandatory, so no matter whose turn it is, when it triggers, it's going on the chain before any optional trigger effects. So if you have a Rise Heart out and your opponent uses Branded Fusion to summon Lubellion, sending Albaz and Despian Tragedies from the deck, both Lubellion's Fusion effect and Tragedy Search effect go on the chain after the attach effect. So you can't just steal the Albaz to prevent the Mirror Jade from coming out. What you can do in this specific situation though is if you already have 3 materials, add a Rise Heart's quick effect as the last chain, because Lubellion getting banished face down will at least stop it from being used in the fusion, which will stop Mirror Jade from coming out. It's also worth noting that the quick effect banish is only a soft once per turn. It's probably not super relevant since you can only do the 1 material summon once per turn, so you're probably not summoning 2 of them in a turn anyway, but it is good to keep in mind in case you summon one and then it survives to your next turn. And one last thing to point out right now is that while shotgunning an Imperm on a Shangri-Ira as soon as it's summoned will stop any of your zones from being locked by it, that technically doesn't stop it from activating the effect, it'll just resolve negated. But a Rise Heart's easy summon effect specifically only needs a successful activation of one of Shangri-Ira's effects, so even if a zone never gets locked, the Rise Heart can still come out onto the board using only 1 monster as material. Alright, now it's time to cover the back row cards. They don't really have a super cohesive theme outside of just getting more monsters on board, but a number of them do have effects that trigger if they're banished, so when we're judging how good these cards are, we should be keeping in mind Rise Heart's effect to banish one from deck as cost, basically making all of these trigger effects always live. Also, a Rise Heart's combination of a Macrocosmos effect and its reattach effect are really good for helping to repeatedly proc them, since they'll get banished by activating them normally, triggering a Rise Heart to attach them, then they'll get banished again just by a Rise Heart detaching them, who can then grab them back right away for you to repeat this process next turn. So we'll start with the field spell, and if you're familiar with the Tearlaments archetype, this is almost identical to their first field spell, Parlereno. Pressured Planet Ratesoth says that when this card is activated, you can add a Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand. Also, monsters you control gain 100 attack and defense for each different attribute on the field. And finally, if a Kashtira Shangri-Ira you control activates an effect, except during the damage step, you can target a card on the field and destroy it. And you can only use that effect once per turn, and only activate 1 Ratesoth per turn. That destruction effect isn't quite as good as Parlereno's because it's a bit harder to time properly, but that attack boost is way more annoying. It rarely gets as big as Parlereno's, but you're constantly having to count all the different attributes on the field and then do a bunch of math over and over. Also, since monsters coming and going from the field can affect your stats, it's important to pay attention to how you sequence your removal and your battle phase. If you're playing Kashtira, removing the wrong monster first could mean suddenly you can't get over your opponent's biggest monster in battle, and if you're playing against Kashtira, getting rid of one of their weaker monsters first could mean suddenly you can get over their biggest monster. And if you have monsters that can be summoned at quick effect speed and their attribute isn't already represented on the board, it could even be a good idea to wait until you're in the battle phase and have already gotten over their biggest monster to then bring your new monster out without giving your opponent an insurmountable battle advantage. Kashtira Birth is a continuous spell that says you can normal summon level 7 monsters without tributing. Also, during your main phase, you can special summon one of your non-Xyz Kashtira monsters that is either banished or in your graveyard. And finally, if your opponent activates a spell card or effect, you can target 3 cards in their graveyard and banish them face down. So this is a fantastic card for resource management. Not only does it recur one of your main deck monsters straight to the field no matter how you used it can remove your opponent's graveyard resources, proc Shangri-Ira, and it can stop your high-level monsters from getting stuck in your hand. Kashtira Theosis is a normal spell that lets you target one Kashtira monster you control to special summon a Kashtira monster with a different attribute from your deck in defense position. And just like Rise Heart, you're locked into Xyz monsters for the rest of the turn. And importantly for both this and Rise Heart, that restriction won't happen if the special summon effect gets negated. That's because the summon and the restriction are part of the same effect. But if the summon fails because your opponent flips something like Gozen Match in response, the restriction does still apply, because the effect uses the also also conjunction, meaning the two pieces of the effect, the summon and the restriction, are totally independent, so even if one fails, the other will still happen. Also, if this card is banished, you can target one of your banished Kashtira cards other than a Kashtira Theosis and add it back to your hand. So this card is also really good. Both the activated and unbanished effects are great. A quick spoiler though, it's generally not going to be the first choice to banish for Raidraptor, but it will be an excellent option for both that and as a banished target to some of the dual archetype monsters as the game goes on and you start to accumulate more banished Kashtira cards. That also makes it an excellent target for Raidraptor's reattach effect. This is also the card that basically makes Unicorn a one-card combo, but we'll talk more later about how far you can get with just that and what else you realistically want to see in your opening hand to be able to go just a little bit further. An important note about Kashtira Theosis, if the monster you target leaves the field or gets flipped face down before resolution, you can't do the special summon. That's because the game state needs to know the attribute of the target at resolution, and if that card isn't there anymore, it can't know. Kashtira Overlap is a quick play spell that lets you target one monster on the field to banish one monster with 1500 attack and 2100 defense from your hand, graveyard, or that is face up on either field, and if you do, the targeted monster gains 1500 attack. Also, if this card becomes banished and you control a Kashtira monster, you can target an effect monster your opponent controls and negate its effects until the end of the turn. This card is pretty mediocre, especially compared to the other ones. The banish effect can be nice sometimes, but it's weird that you have to control a Kashtira monster for that to work, and that activated effect is insanely niche. There are only two monsters in the entire game with those stats that aren't a Visa Starfrost lore counterpart. At best, it would be a cheeky play against one of those archetypes, or an okay banish to summon one of the dual archetype monsters, but even then it's a 2-card going second only play. It's really not worth playing it just for the very bad battle trap and the occasional imperm effect. Kashtira Preparations is a continuous trap, and it really is a mirror to Birth. It says that during either player's turn, you can special summon one of your Kashtira monsters that is banished or in your hand. Also, if your opponent activates a trap card, and you control a Kashtira monster, and this card is already face up on the field, you can look at your opponent's hand and banish a card from it face down. So that's not a bad card. And this is the card I mentioned that I'll play one of to search off of Ogre. It's not as good as Birth, but still being able to bring back another banished monster each turn is pretty cool. And being able to hand rep can be really nice, but that's super slow since you need to get this face up, then your opponent needs to activate a trap, and not a ton of those are going off without waiting another turn. But as long as there is a good trap deck like Labyrinth in the meta, this can still be a pretty decent card. Also, unlike Birth, this special summon effect doesn't specify non-Xyz monsters, so if your Shangri-Ira gets hit with a Kaiju while you still have a Raidraptor up, you can just bring it back if you want. Or even better, if your Raidraptor gets destroyed, you can quick effect banish it to special summon one of the dual archetype monsters, then use this to get it back on field. Kashtira Big Bang is a normal trap that's kind of like a two-sided evenly matched for monsters. It says if a Kashtira Xyz monster is on the field, not just your field, then if either player controls 2 or more monsters, they have to banish all but one of them face down. Also, if this card becomes banished, you can target a Kashtira Xyz monster you control and add one Kashtira monster you own that's attached to it as material to your hand, then you can special summon that monster. This is a pretty nice card with an okay main effect that'll come up occasionally, but most importantly, this will be your #1 early target for Raidraptor if you're trying to go for a full combo. It basically turns Raidraptor into a double extender. It can special summon itself, then send this for cost, so even if the effect gets negated and a Raidraptor doesn't become a level 7, you can still at least get another body on board. We're almost done with the cards now, and we'll get into the specifics of a few different combo lines after that. Another cool synergy for Big Bang comes from a Raidraptor. Its reattach effect being mandatory makes it very easy to get both a monster and Big Bang onto it as material. Then when you go to use its quick effect banish, detach Big Bang but leave the monster as material. That way you not only get to banish an opponent's card, but you also get to proc Big Bang's banish effect, making a Raidraptor's quick effect banish even stronger, since it effectively gets you a card for removing an opponent's card. There's actually one more card that isn't out yet at the time of recording this, but it is coming out in the next core set, so it'll probably be out before this video is, so we'll cover it here. Kashtira Extra is a quick play spell that says if your Kashtira Xyz monster is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish a Visa Starfrost from your hand, deck, or monster zone, and if you do, special summon a Vicious Stroud from your extra deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. And if it's banished, you can add a banished Visa Starfrost back to your hand. Vicious Stroud is a new Dark Fairy Fusion monster with 3000 attack and defense that takes a Visa Starfrost and a monster with the stats of its counterpart monsters as material, and normally must be summoned by banishing those materials from your field or graveyard. It can't be destroyed by battle, and if it's special summoned, you can target and destroy one monster on the field, and if you do, it gains half of the attack of the destroyed monster. So it's nothing super special. It can be a fun gotcha if they destroy your Raidraptor, but too often when you lose your Raidraptor, it's going to be because of a Lava Golem or a Kaiju or a Nibiru, so you won't be able to activate this card, or it'll be like a board breaker at the beginning of their turn when they don't even have a monster for you to destroy to take full advantage of this. And for now, plus another core set, that's the whole archetype. So now that we're done with the cards, we'll cover in depth a few different types of combos this deck can do before we get into our discussion of cards and strategies that can be used to counter the archetype, followed by our list of cards that pair really well with it. These combos I've picked include a very basic one you can do with an awkward hand to make the most of it, and of course the infamous 9-zone lock combo. And for the most part, these won't be strict card combinations that you need. One of the nice things about this deck is that you can generally do at least something from almost any opening hand. So many of the cards interact with so many others that the archetype is pretty flexible. So let's say we just open Unicorn. Let's see how far that can take us and see how much further we can go if we happen to open an extra card. You can start by special summoning Unicorn, then use its effect to search Kashtira Theosis. Activate Theosis targeting Unicorn to summon a Fenrir from deck. Then Fenrir effect to search Raidraptor, and activate Raidraptor to special summon itself. From here real quick, we have a bit bit of a bonus combo. If you're really trying to dodge Nibiru or any other targeted hate like Lava Golem, especially in games 2 and 3, you can activate Rise Heart to dump Big Bang, it'll then become a level 7, and then immediately overlay all 3 of them into a Rise Heart for your 4th summon. So this plays around Nibiru, it literally only needs you to open Unicorn, and with Big Bang banished, as soon as something else gets banished, a Rise Heart can attach it, then when you're ready to use a Rise Heart's quick effect, you can detach Big Bang and any other 2 cards other than the Fenrir, to then trigger Big Bang and get that Fenrir onto the field. All of that paired with the fact that you have a thick Macrocosmos on field is a fairly decent end board, and it does a really good job of playing around some of this deck's biggest threats. Now back to the combo at hand. From here you can overlay the 2 level 7s into a Shangri-Ira, then activate Rise Heart to banish Big Bang, become a level 7, and banish the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck face down. Now you can trigger Shangri-Ira as Chainlink 1 and Big Bang as Chainlink 2. Use Big Bang to add and special summon, say, Fenrir from under the Shangri-Ira, and lock the first of your opponent's zones. Now from here we have a couple options. If Unicorn is literally the only archetype card you opened, you can just summon a Rise Heart over the Rise Heart and pass. And hopefully that means those other 4 cards you opened were good hand traps and whatnot to help you deal with more interruption. And honestly, like we just talked about, this really isn't the worst end board in the world. It does, however, have some trade-offs with the bonus combo we just talked about. The positives are that you can use Shangri-Ira during your opponent's standby phase to get a Fenrir from deck. That way you basically start their turn with one, instead of having to wait and attach and detach a Big Bang. Also, you have an extra body on board that your opponent has to get through if they want to get to your life points. And it's a body that has its own built-in protection. The downsides, though, are your Rise Heart doesn't start out with 3 materials, it only starts out with 1, unless you were able to get another card banished after making a Rise Heart, and it also plays into Nibiru, Lava Golem, and even Sphere mode if you use Shangri-Ira during the standby phase. But doing that plays even harder into a Curry card Diff Incarnate. It's a card we'll talk about a little bit later, but having even more monsters on board that have activated their effects that turn could come back to bite you. So if you only opened Unicorn, it probably is better to just go a Rise Heart pass. But if we open basically any other Kashtira card, we can do better. So let's see if we can do enough better to make it worth playing into Nibiru. So let's say we also open Kashtira Birth, but this will really work with any number of hands, like opening one of the dual archetype monsters to summon by banishing Theosis, or Birth plus a level 7 to normal summon without tributing, or even just another Rise Heart that you can normal summon and overlay a Rise Heart onto. Really, as long as you're just able to get one more level 7 on board, you have options. So with Birth in hand, you can overlay the 2 monsters we already have on board for number 89 Diablosis the Mind Hacker. And this guy's going to show up a lot in this deck, so let's just cover it here real quick. And here's the biggest change that was made by the ban list. This card is now very rightfully banned. The video will go into more detail on specifically how crazy this card is later, but basically all the horrifying zone locks you've seen online are mostly the fault of this guy. I'm going to leave in the combos that use Diablosis for education's sake, and also the fact that even though Diablosis plays the role of a combo piece, it is very much a part of your end board, so you can basically always follow along and just make a different rank 7 at that point, because really the major difference between all of these combos here is how you accrue and allocate your resources before going into your rank 7s. It's a rank 7 Dark Psychic with 2800 attack and 1200 defense, and its first effect is an ignition effect that lets you detach a material to look at your opponent's extra deck and banish a card from it face down. And that effect is a soft once per turn, by the way. It also has the effect that when a card your opponent owns and possesses is banished face down, you can banish cards from the top of your opponent's deck face down equal to the number of their currently face down banished cards. We'll do the math later on how insanely fast that effect snowballs, but it's basically a turn 3 deck out. It also has the effect that at the end of the battle phase, if it destroyed a monster by battle, you can target and banish face down one card from your opponent's graveyard. But that effect is a lot less relevant here. The most important thing is that first effect to banish from the extra deck will trigger its mill effect. So what we can do here is make Diablosis, then detach Fenrir to banish something from the opponent's extra deck, then Chainlink 1 Shangri-Ira, Chainlink 2 Mind Hacker to banish now 4 cards from the top of their deck face down, and lock the second zone. That banishing will of course trigger Shangri-Ira one more time to lock a third zone. Now you can activate Birth, activate its effect to special summon Fenrir from the grave, and overlay for a Rise Heart. And if you feel safe doing so, use Shangri-Ira during your opponent's standby phase to get another Fenrir. Also, during your opponent's turn, the first time they play a card, you can activate a Rise Heart to target and banish it face down, even if it's just like a normal spell card or something, because that'll trigger Shangri-Ira and Diablosis again, who will then of course trigger Shangri-Ira again, giving you 2 more zone locks for a total of 5. This means that as long as that one card they played wasn't a board breaker that's going to undo everything, this combo can lock an entire row. Now for being just a Unicorn plus basically any other card, this is a pretty strong combo. Although having this many monsters on board, each of whom is going to activate its effect on the opponent's turn, does play into pretty much all of this deck's biggest threats. So if you want to play it a bit safer, instead of Fenrir you can recycle the Unicorn through Big Bang, still detach the Unicorn from Diablosis, and then hold the Birth in hand and leave the Unicorn engraved for follow-up. Then since 3 zone locks doesn't really do much unless you're against a Pendulum deck, you can summon a Rise Heart over the Shangri-Ira. This plays into slightly fewer threats, and this gets you a Macrocosmos, a quick effect face down banish, and in reaction to that banish, a huge face down banishing mill from Diablosis. It's not quite as strong of an end board, but it is still a lot, and having Unicorn engrave and Birth in hand is more than enough to come all the way back into the game on turn 3 if you got punished for extending too far. Now for the second combo, what do we do if we open a slightly awkward hand where we don't have immediate access to Unicorn? So let's say we open just Rise Heart and Birth. Now this combo is really going to highlight how impactful a smart banish from Rise Heart can be, especially in the mid game. Also, I guess it'll really reinforce just how insane of a card Birth is. So what can we do with this hand? Well, we can normal summon Rise Heart, then activate its effect, this time banishing a unicorn. Then activate Birth, then activate Birth's effect to special summon the unicorn. Then activate the unicorn to get Theosis, use Theosis targeting either of them to get a Fenrir, then use the Fenrir to get one of the dual archetype monsters, like say Scareclaw Kashtira. Then you can make Shangri-Ira, then summon the Scareclaw by banishing Theosis, overlay for a Mind Hacker, and the rest is the same. This gets us 2 zone locks, 1 extra deck rip, and again if you feel safe with it, Shangri-Ira to get a Fenrir in the standby phase. The major distinction between these two combos was that we had to use Rise Heart's effect before we had a Shangri-Ira on field, so we couldn't banish Big Bang from the deck to get one of those materials back. So if you hard drew Big Bang, you could banish that instead of the Theosis to summon Scareclaw, and finish on the exact same end board, just with 1 fewer zones locked, and at the cost of 1 more card. Of course, just like last time, you can always go a Rise Heart pass after using the Fenrir search, or go halfway with it and make a Rise Heart over the Scareclaw or the Shangri-Ira, either of which would leave you with a Fenrir on board, so you wouldn't need to use the Shangri-Ira in the standby phase. But of course, all of those plays have the exact same strengths and weaknesses we've talked about already. The point is, you have options. Okay, now for the crazy one. Of course, this isn't going to be a mega consistent combo, since as far as I know, it is a 3-card combo, and interrupting it pretty much anywhere will stop it from locking all the way. But it is still important to know how it works, so you can take full advantage of a good hand if you're playing Kashtira, or recognize it's about to happen to you and stop it if you're playing against it. The early parts of this combo are going to play out very differently from the others, but the end is going to be basically the same. The fundamental difference that makes it possible to do this is basically that you're able to accrue enough materials to make a second Shangri-Ira before Diablosis. Then when you use Diablosis' effects to double trigger your Shangri-Ira, you get to double up on the zone locking. So to get access to that many resources, you need to open either Theosis or Birth. We really only get 1 spell search a turn, and we're going to need both of these cards. We also need the field spell. It gets us another monster, and it's also going to let us be a little bit tricky and use its destruction effect on our own Shangri-Ira, letting us use the protection effect to dump one of the materials to the grave, where we can get it back with Birth. And we also need either a Fenrir or a Unicorn. Just like the spells, we need them both for the combo, but we can easily search whichever one we don't open. So let's say we open Fenrir, Raitsoth, and Kashtira Theosis. We can start with Raitsoth and grab Unicorn, then summon Unicorn and search Birth. And from here it's the same no matter what the opening hand. The combo opener is literally just search the 2 you didn't open. Then you can activate Birth and normal summon Fenrir. Then Fenrir search Rise Heart just like before. Now we need to be particular about how we cycle these next effects, since we're going to take full advantage of things like a Rise Heart's Macrocosmos effect. We can go ahead and overlay Fenrir and Unicorn for a Shangri-Ira, then activate the Rise Heart to special summon itself, then activate Rise Heart's other effect, this time banishing a monster, specifically one of the dual archetype monsters. So let's say we banish Tearlewin's Kashtira. Of course then Rise Heart becomes a level 7, banishes the top 3 cards of the opponent's deck face down, and triggers Shangri-Ira to lock the first zone. Now we do the sneaky thing we mentioned earlier, and since the Shangri-Ira effect was activated, we can trigger Raitsoth to target and destroy Shangri-Ira. Of course, use its effects to protect itself and detach material instead, sending Fenrir to the graveyard. Now use the Rise Heart on field as material to summon a Rise Heart. Then activate Theosis, targeting either of them to summon Ogre from the deck. Since a Rise Heart is on the field, Theosis will get banished, and we can now chainlink one a Rise Heart, chainlink 2 Theosis, to add the tier back to hand and attach Theosis to a Rise Heart. Now use Ogre to search Big Bang, since we didn't send it for Rise Heart like we did in the first combo. Now activate tier in hand, banishing the Big Bang to special summon itself, triggering chainlink 1 a Rise Heart, chainlink 2 Big Bang, to add and summon the Unicorn from under the Shangri-Ira, and attach Big Bang to a Rise Heart who now has 3 materials. Now activate Birth's effect to special summon Fenrir from the grave, and we have enough material on board to make a second Shangri-Ira and a Diablosis. And from here, the rest is the same. Activate Diablosis, banishing a card from the opponent's extra deck face down, then make a chain from a Rise Heart, both Shangri-Ira and Diablosis. This gets you 4 more cards banished face down from the top of their deck, 2 more locked zones for a total of 3, and one of your opponent's banished cards as material on a Rise Heart. Diablosis' effect in that chain will of course then trigger a Rise Heart and both Shangri-Ira again, getting you another material and locking 2 more zones for a total of 5. Now we can pass the turn, and what's important to note here is that we have at least 3 materials under our Rise Heart, so the second they put anything in one of their 5 open zones, we can detach 3 to banish it face down, triggering the exact same gambit that just happened, getting another material, this time a ton of cards banished face down from the top of the deck, and locking another 4 zones. And if your opponent didn't open one of the specific blowout cards that this deck is really weak to, there's not much they can do with just 1 zone, especially if the other 2 cards in your opening hand were good interruptions. Now, before we summarize the strengths and weaknesses and look at cards that are good with and against Kashtira, there are 2 quick but very important things we need to talk about with respect to these combos. The first is that these combos, especially that last one, are definitely going first plays. Locking a bunch of zones isn't going to do anything to your opponent when they already have a full board, and even if you wanted to, you can't lock zones that are already being used, so in that situation you should have very different priorities. So what do we do about going second? Well, in that case you might still want to make a Shangri-Ira, and do the Rise Heart Big Bang play just to trigger Shangri-Ira once so you can use the Shangri-Ira as material for a Rise Heart, because that can ultimately be a more economically advantageous way of getting into a Rise Heart. Basically, starting from Unicorn, doing it this way can get you a 2 material Rise Heart with 2 other materials on board for another rank 7, whereas just going straight for a Rise Heart, you would just get a 3 material Rise Heart with some other cards set up in the banish pile for later. But it does come at the cost of fewer summons and fewer effect activations, meaning fewer windows of interruption for your opponent, so it could still be a better option. But whatever you choose to do, you'll probably be playing the deck in a vaguely similar way, just with a different goal in mind. By that I mean you'll be playing to spam as many level 7s on board for materials material as possible, you'll just be making different Xyz monsters. Instead of Diablosis, you'll make the rank 7s that are good at breaking boards, like number 11 Big Eye to steal an opponent's monster permanently, or Dark Armed the Dragon of Annihilation that can not only destroy as many of your opponent's cards as the number of materials you made it with, it'll also have you banish your own cards from the graveyard, so you might even get the chance to proc one of your banish effects, or at least put a monster where you can get it back with birth and preparation. Now the last thing we need to talk about here is how to decide which zones to lock, and I think that it's mostly straightforward. It just might depend on a few things. First, if you're able to pull off locking 5 zones on turn 1, then it's best to go for the back row. The best monsters against Kashtira are Nibiru and all of the Kaiju-like monsters. The Lava Golem goes on your field, so it doesn't even matter if all their monster zones are locked, and you aren't even able to lock 5 zones before you do 5 summons, so locking the monster zones won't stop Nibiru from coming out either. The best option is to prevent the blowout back row cards like Evenly Matched or Book of Eclipse, but if you're not able to lock 5 in one turn, then you might want to approach it a little bit differently. And that's because it only takes one of those power back row cards to totally undo your board, so there's really no difference between them having one free back row zone and having 5, so it might actually be better to lock a few monster zones, especially since using a Rise Heart on the first card they put on the board to go through and trigger everything to get a couple more zones locked could end up locking that row out entirely. You just can't do it until they've used a card. If it turns out you're against a combo deck, that could be great for stopping them from accumulating the material on board they need to get to an extra deck monster with removal. Of course, if it turns out you're against a deck like Labyrinth, then it definitely would have still been better to lock the back row, so it's a bit of a meta call at that point. And of course, that's all assuming it's game 1, so you still don't know what your opponent is playing. If you're able to get hand knowledge in game 2 or 3, or you're just bold enough to summon more than 5 times to lock a bunch of zones after side decking without hand knowledge, then you can make a more informed decision. Of course, that's just how I've been thinking about it, but if you have different thoughts about it, please let me know in the comments. It's always nice to hear other perspectives on these things, especially when there isn't really a single right answer. So, after all that, it's pretty obvious that Kashtira is a very strong archetype, but before we go in depth on how to undermine all of that and beat Kashtira, let's dig a little bit deeper into exactly why it's so strong. The first major reason is a trait shared by most of the best decks, and that's its consistency. There really aren't too many bad opening hands. It's pretty hard to open a hand that can't at least go a Rise Heart pass, and even a lot of the hands that can't do that can at least make a Shangri-Ira to get a Fenrir in the standby phase. Then you have 2 big bodies on board, one of which can do a pretty good job of protecting itself. That, combined with a well-timed face-down banish from Fenrir, can sometimes just be enough to help you survive to turn 3 to come back. Also, this deck's board spamming ability is absolutely insane given that it's spamming out high-level, high-attack monsters, and not just combo pieces or tokens for material. And that's not just on the setup either. Between Birth, Preparations, the banish effects on Big Bang and Theosis, this archetype has incredible recursion. If you out this board, but don't close out the game and you leave Birth on board, they are 100% coming back into the game. That also means that this archetype can often put up lethal damage with just main deck monsters, so even though it's an Xyz archetype and Dimensional Barrier will hurt it a bit, it's definitely not the game-ending card that it is against other archetypes. On the opposite end from board spamming, the deck can still put up a formidable board even without doing that, so even though Nibiru is absolutely devastating to this deck, it can play around that by just going a Rise Heart pass. A Macrocosmos and a face-down banish isn't incredible by any stretch of the imagination, but it is really good given that it's a backup plan. A lot of decks don't have any sort of backup plan, let alone one this good. Also, the deck is relatively simple. Other than a big board lock combo, there's nothing you need to memorize, and all of the cards individually have very simple and very impactful effects. You just open a bunch of cards, you put them on the board, half of them search another card to put on the board, and then you overlay. But that's not to say you can't do a lot better by being creative with your plays. The deck does have plenty of room for that, but the power you can get out of Kashtira, even if you're playing while half asleep, is crazy. Also, being an archetype seemingly inspired by Diablosis, it not only supports, but maximally enables what is one of the most insane Xyz monsters that isn't currently banned. A lot of people have pointed out how it's wild, but there is another point that I don't think gets quite enough attention that for me really pushes this card over the top. Of course, it's wild that it enables Shangri-Ira to lock way too many zones going first, and it's way too strong to have an ignition effect to rip from your opponent's extra deck, totally warping deck building in a way that probably isn't super healthy, especially when they have to play things to handle an Ibli lock, which is something we'll talk specifics about in a little bit. Like, at least Unicorn is a trigger effect, so you sort of get the option to play around it or play into it. But to me, the thing that makes it truly insane is that last effect to face down banished cards from the top of your opponent's deck equal to the number of cards they already have banished face down. Obviously, turn 1 that's not a lot, but it gets out of hand so insanely fast, it's basically a guaranteed turn 3 deck out. So let's do some math on this. Say you do the very basic combo and end on Shangri-Ira, a Rise Heart, and Diablosis. Then you've already face down banished 3 from the top of the deck for Rise Heart. Now you can use Diablosis, rip 1 from the extra deck, so there are now 4, and Diablosis triggers itself to banish another 4. So going into their turn, they have 8 cards banished face down, 7 of which are from the main deck. Then during their turn, you use a Rise Heart or maybe one of the main deck Kashtiras to banish another card face down, making it 9. Then Diablosis triggers, banishing another 9 from the top for a total of 18. Then if you survive to the next turn with Mind Hacker, or if you're just able to make a second one, you can activate it adding a 19th card to the pile, triggering it to banish 19 more cards off the top face down. That's 38 cards over 3 turns, 36 of which were main deck cards. Between that, the opening hand, and their draw, that's over 40. Now there is one saving grace here, and that's that Diablosis has to be able to banish exactly that number face down, so it can't actually deck you out. As soon as your deck gets too small, it can't activate that effect anymore. So if you're playing 40 cards, that third activation we just described described wouldn't be able to go off, but it still would have banished at least 17 of your main deck cards face down, so it's probably going to banish a lot of your combo pieces, a lot of your search targets. Even if you have half a deck left, it's still going to hurt. It very likely means that even if you can break the Kashtira board, if you don't finish the game out right then, you won't have any follow-up. It also means that decks that play an important Garnet or a one-of combo piece are nearly unplayable as long as this is in the meta. And of course, any deck that's really tight on extra deck space and has a couple really important one-of combo pieces is also in big trouble. Also, any deck that wants a consistency tool like one of the pot cards. This card just has so much utility and so much ability to make your own deck work against you. Okay, so we just spent a while talking about how good it can be, but what's the downside? And what cards or strategies can we play to counter it? And after that, we'll get to all the cards that are good with the archetype, or ones that look good but might not actually be that good, and a couple that aren't good but might be good with it in the future. Well, for one thing, it's a glass cannon. It has a lot of power, but it can fall apart pretty hard. We've talked about it already, but basically all of those combos collapse instantly to a Nibiru. And given the stats of Shangri-Ira, it's pretty easy to find a time to fire off Nibiru so that the token actually has less attack than Nibiru itself. You basically have to choose if you want to go for a stronger end board and risk losing instantly. Similarly, any deck going first that can put a card on the Kashtira player's empty field is going to hurt them big time. There are still some ways they work around it, like if they can normal summon Riseheart, they can use it and the token for Dawn or Dagger for hire, who can clear itself and one of your monsters off the board, or if they happen to open both Birth and a level 7, but either way, it is still massively interruptive. You may have also noticed that this archetype has exactly 0 built-in negates, which really adds to its fragility, being totally unable to stop board breakers. Another thing is that a Riseheart's reattach effect being mandatory adds a surprising amount of vulnerability. All you have to do is activate any spell card, then because of a Riseheart's Macrocosmos effect, it'll get banished after it resolves, triggering the Riseheart effect to attach something, leaving it wide open for you to activate something like Psyframe Gear Gamma. Also, a forced activation makes it a sitting duck for something like Kurikar Div Incarnate. The next thing to turn our attention back to is the effects of the original 3 level 7s. Remember, their effects to banish cards are all trigger effects, not quick effects, so they can't chain to you activating a monster effect. They have to wait for the chain where that monster effect is activated to resolve, and then their banished effect can go on a new chain. Unlike something like Exosister that can actively banish your cards with quick effects and traps. This makes potential quick effect board wipe effects, like Zeus or even Godi of the Deep Beyond, even better against Kashtira, because they can't respond with their banished effects if they're just not on the board anymore. Also, when we look at the cards in their entirety, there are really only 2 major on-field threats. Riseheart and Fenrir are the only 2 that can actually banish something from the field. Unicorn can hurt, but you can also deck build around it, and Ogre is at worst a nuisance. Scareclaw can be pretty strong with its negation effect, but it's a battle phase oriented effect, so it's not too hard to play around. You can even cancel its own attack by imperming it. Right now, the biggest threats this deck has are the Macrocosmos and the potential to mega board lock. I guess Preparation's hand ripping is pretty rough, but not only is it insanely slow, but it also has to already be face up on the field when they activate a trap, so it's also super telegraphed. Also, while this removal is fairly strong, all of it targets, so literally any big body that has targeting protection is going to be hard for the deck to out. For example, Branded can easily make Red Eye's Dark Dragoon, negate one thing with it, and now it has 4000 attack, and the only in-archetype way to deal with that is Scareclaw Kashtira's battle negation, turning off that targeting protection. Okay, now for some specific cards to counter the deck. By far the best are Nibiru and any kaiju-like monster, because like we mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter if they've locked your zones if you're just planning on using theirs. Of course, when people are just going a Riseheart pass, then an actual kaiju or Santa Claus are best, but if they're ever getting brave and ending on more than just that, then Lava Golem is better, and Nibiru is back to being really good. Also, if they go for the 9-zone lock, or some other combo comes up with these cards in the future that ends on more monsters, then of course Sphere Mode becomes really good. A card that sort of half fits this category, and one of my personal favorite cards ever since it came out, is Kurikara Div Incarnate. It summons itself by tributing all of your opponent's monsters that have activated an effect on field that turn, and it gains 1500 attack for each. And you may have noticed that almost every single play we've described so far involves activating an on-field effect of every single one of your monsters on your opponent's turn. A Riseheart having a mandatory effect means that it literally can't play around this card unless its effects are negated. This also means if they go for the 9-zone lock and they leave you with 1 monster zone like they probably should, you can tribute all 4 of those monsters on board, and Kurikara will have 7500 attack. It also has an incredible bonus effect to steal a monster from your opponent's graveyard during your end phase, assuming you didn't already win, of course. It's really nice to see this card get the super specific meta it needed to shine just a little bit, at least once. All the generic mass removal cards are pretty good too, like Geki, Lightning Storm, Dark Hole. These won't get rid of a Shangri-Ira that still has material, but they will get rid of everything else. Mass removal options that can deal with a Shangri-Ira with material are evenly matched, very good against this deck, and also things like the much newer Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon or Waybridge. Of course, only one of those can be activated on your first turn, so a good option to nullify a lot of monsters going second is Book of Eclipse. Of course, this can be ashed, so Book of Moon can be a really good substitute. Like we've already touched on, this deck has no built-in negates, so it's pretty likely that any of these board breakers will work. Dimensional Barrier isn't bad, especially when Branded is in the meta too, but it's not quite the turn ender for Kashtira that it is for something like Branded. Obviously, not getting to Zone Lock or end on a Riseheart is going to hurt a lot. Like we said earlier, the main deck monsters themselves are also pretty strong. Also, if you're going to do this, make sure to do it after they use either Theosis or Riseheart, because those effects lock them into Xyz monsters, so they can't just pivot into a Blackluster Soldier of Chaos, or a Barone or something like that. Chaos Hunter is also a pretty good card. One problem though, is that if they have the field spell up, then literally all but one of the level 7s is guaranteed to be able to just run run this over in battle. And much less likely, but still a little bit dangerous, it is a level 7. So if they're running enemy controller or change of heart, there's a small chance that they'll just steal this card and use it as material. Realistically though, if you're going second, the fact that you can bring this out on your opponent's turn is fantastic, and it'll be a pretty big interruption for a Kashtira player. The fact that it's a level 7 almost makes it really good for the mirror match. Like, not only can you stop your opponent from getting to what they want to do, but then you start your turn with a free material. Unfortunately though, when you're playing Kashtira, you do really want to start your first turn with an empty board, because unless you also opened Birth and a level 7, or like Rise Heart to normal summon, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot. A much better option for the mirror match would be Artifact Lancia. It'll only last one turn, and it'll affect you too, so you really only want to play it going second, but at least it won't clog your zones. In a similar vein, for Floodgates to counter Kashtira, both Imperial Iron Wall and Skill Drain are pretty good. Both of these specifically showed off their abilities that they would use to get rid of them. Also, Goes and Match, and There Can Be Only One, work really well too. But for these two, if the one monster they put up is Fenrir, then when Fenrir declares an attack, if this isn't paired with one of the other Floodgates, they can just activate its effects to banish this. And specifically for There Can Be Only One, if they get Fenrir out, since Rise Heart is a warrior, they can search Rise Heart, summon it, activate its effect, and then go into any rank 7 that isn't a Psychic or a warrior. Okay, now let's talk about some cards you should consider playing in Kashtira, or to be prepared for when you're playing against it. Of course, since the last video was all about this, we'll start with the Adventure Engine. And the short of it is, it's okay. It's not exactly bad. Obviously the engine is very powerful. It's just really suboptimal for this deck. Of course, an Omni Negate to stop a Nibiru or an Evenly Matched is really nice. It just doesn't do enough for the deck to justify how much space it takes. Also, the second wave of support for these cards came out into a meta where hand traps were really good, so you'd really just rather see one of those instead. Of course, the banlist could come along and decimate this deck, leaving it with plenty of room for these cards and needing all the help it can get. Pot of Prosperity is an insane card in this deck. Yes, for all the normal reasons it's a very good card, but in Kashtira it serves a second purpose. Since a Rise Heart can attach banished cards to itself, including face-down banished cards, and Prosperity lets you pick the cards you banish, it basically has an extra effect to attach an extra deck monster to a Rise Heart, specifically Infinitrack Goliath. This will give your Rise Heart some very much needed destruction immunity, and you can also play Garura to at least get a draw if you hit with a Kaiju. I've also seen some people playing Pot of Desires in addition to Pot of Prosperity, since more draw power is always nice, and this combined with the Rise Heart can actually be an okay way to get even more cards from the main deck into rotation. Also, people have been off and on playing the Ibli lock. There's a decent chance that by the time this video is out, nobody will be doing it anymore, but we should still cover it. Since Kashtira never locks itself into Xyz for a full turn, you can always open your turn by getting a Kashtira on board, then using your normal summon on Nightmare Corrupt or Ibli, then link it off for something like Lingaribo to lock your opponent into link monsters. It's pretty cheesy, and it can literally be countered by just playing a single Lingaribo in your extra deck, but against a deck like Branded that locks itself into fusions for a whole turn, it can be really powerful. Also, if they only play one copy of Lingaribo, you can rip it with Diablosis or Unicorn. Obviously, it's not searchable in engine, and it needs your normal summon, so it's not super consistent like the Scythe lock used to be, but if you want to give it a shot, there are a number of really convenient small world bridges for the deck. Other than just being annoying, Ibli can also serve a really important second purpose, and that's that it can stop Nibiru, because that lock into links isn't just on the extra deck, it's on all special summons. So if you can put an Ibli on your opponent's board before your 5th summon, then they can't activate Nibiru. But be careful about the meta if you want to do this, because Ibli can be countered pretty hard by a Bestial, or a DD Crow. A card that can stop Nibiru and Evenly Matched, as well as pretty much any other card as long as you play a copy in your deck, is Crossout Designator. Unfortunately though, it can't stop Lava Golem, or Korikara, or anything like that. It does however have a fun little synergy with the deck, where if you just need another Xyz material, you can just activate it on your own turn, banish one of your Kashtiras from the deck, and special summon it with Birth. You obviously won't get to use any of its effects, it is just a body for Xyz material, but your opponent will get a chuckle out of it. For more pretty good protection, specifically against spells and traps, you can run Forbidden Lance. Dimension Shifter is also a great card for the deck, not only offensively to hurt other decks, but it also protects you when you're going first against a bunch of different hand traps. Specifically in the current meta, both Droll and Lockbird and Ghost Ogre can't be activated under Shifter, since they have to be sent to the graveyard as cost. For more consistency, there's Sacred Sword of 7 stars. It's a Pot of Greed, and the cost is actually something that can be beneficial for the deck. Sadly, the fact that you need a second card in hand to even use it in the first place, and you need access to even a third card to actually turn that cost into a benefit, makes it just entirely outclassed by Desires. And the fact that Prosperity is even better than Desires makes this at best the third best draw card for the deck. Now, since Kashtira is a rank 7 archetype, obviously we should see if there are any other Xyz monsters worth considering. We've already mentioned both Big Eye and the Dark Arm Dragon Xyz retrain, but Mega Phantom Beast Draco Sack is also a great card. It can out a skill drain since it tributes itself for cost to pop a card on the field. It's also great since the tokens it makes can be used to make Cherubini, who can then Foolish Burial any level 3 monster. This was an important combo in the OCG after their ban list took out tier elements, since this could be a consistent way to get King of the Swamp into the graveyard to replace Kit Kalos to make Roll Kalos. Given the time rules, it might not be a bad idea to play Red Eye's Flare Metal Dragon. Also, before the ban list that got rid of Barrier Statue with the Stormwinds, people were talking about Raidraptor Arsenal Falcon, since it can special summon a level 4 winged beast from the deck. Obviously you can't do that now, but if there's ever another busted level 4 winged beast, this could be great. Volafrenige the Darkest Dragon Doom Rider can be a pretty good way to out a Towers monster by giving one of your monsters a really nice attack boost. And if your opponent also happens to control a non-Towers monster, you can even get a bonus removal out of it. But no matter what your opponent's board looks like, as long as you have Volafrenige Volafrenige plus another monster, you can always guarantee that other monster a 2100 attack boost by having Volafrenige destroy itself. In fact, if you have Ogre on board, who naturally has 2800 attack, and then you do that, Ogre's attack will go up to 4900. Then if you have the field spell, and your opponent is sitting on a rival Cyberus at Ignister, since Ogre is a water monster and a rival Cyberus is a dark, and even if those are the only two monsters on board, Ogre's attack will go up to 5100, meaning if a rival Cyberus was only made with 5 materials, you'll be able to run it over in battle. A neat option that isn't good yet would be Odd Eye's Absolute Dragon. You can summon it into the EMZ, then if you haven't already Xyz locked yourself, you can link it off for Gravity Controller, getting you access to that potential removal, and triggering Absolute Dragon's effect to special summon almost any Odd Eyes monster from your extra deck. That makes this one more of an option to look out for in the future, since the Odd Eyes archetype does occasionally get new support. Some of the best current targets though include Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon. It's a compulse for an opponent's attack position monster on summon, and if for whatever reason you're playing a whole Odd Eyes Kashtira deck, and you have a face-up Pendulum monster in your extra deck, you get access to an Omni Negate. Odd Eyes Wing Dragon gives you a spell speed 1 imperm, and if it's destroyed it goes to a Pendulum zone, where it can give you an Honest effect. Technically, you can use Odd Eyes Rebellion Dragon Overlord to go into Odd Eyes Rebellion Dragon for some monster destruction and burn damage, or Odd Eyes Raging Dragon to wipe your opponent's field and get an attack boost, or even Odd Eyes Rebellion Xyz Dragon whenever we get it, who has an ignition effect to pop 2 of your opponent's monsters with 3000 or less attack. But all of that is way too slow, since you can only summon Rebellion Dragon Overlord once per turn, and the way you do any of that is by summoning it once, destroying it so it goes to your Pendulum zone, then using its Pendulum effect to special summon itself, and Xyz summon a different one on top of it. But of those 3 we mentioned, Rebellion Xyz Dragon will have its own effect to get itself a material to pop 2 monsters, but it's on the Pendulum effect, so you still have to find a way to destroy your own monster. And finally, who could forget Odd Eyes Meteor Burst Dragon to counter the always oppressive War Rocks. Both of the purely rank 7s are actually pretty neat. One can spin a card back to the deck, and the other is a Dark Ruler no more, except it doesn't prevent your opponent from taking damage for the rest of the turn. Although a better version of that effect comes from Mermail Abyss Gaios. It does require 2 water monsters, but not only is its Dark Ruler effect a quick effect, it also has a neat little bonus of while it has Xyz material, level 5 or higher monsters cannot declare attacks. That does hurt your main deck monsters, but as long as you just overlay them into an Xyz monster, you'll be fine. And just for the record, in case it ever comes up, the highest attack you can currently get generically for a 2 material rank 7 is 2800, the highest defense is 3100, and if you want to invest in another material, you can get to number C6, Chronomaly Chaos Atlantis, who has 3300 attack and defense, and it can gain an additional 1000 attack by using its effect to target and equip one of your opponent's monsters to it as an equip spell. But if you do that, your opponent doesn't take any more damage for the rest of the turn, so at best this will be good for getting over like a relatively small towers. Technically number 7 Lucky Straight can get up to 4200 attack, but you have to bet on the dice. For other extra deck options, since most of our monsters are level 7, we can always make Broen by normal summoning one of the Ghost Scroll hand traps. If you're looking for an aggressive Link monster, this deck is great for Blackluster Soldier, Soldier of Chaos. Also Boral Sword Dragon is always good. I might even pick it over Access Code in this deck, just so you don't have to waste extra deck space on other Link monsters. Also you can get kinda goofy with it. If you have enough material to summon it and leave a Scareclaw Kashtira on board, you can summon the Scareclaw in attack position, then attack with Boral Sword first, then use its effect to switch the Scareclaw to defense. As far as Floodgates go, there really aren't any great options. The problem is all of your monsters have different attributes, except a couple, and all of your monsters are psychics, except for a Rise Heart. It's just hard to find a Floodgate that isn't also going to be really awkward for you to work around. Technically Macrocosmos fits the vibe of the deck, but a Rise Heart is so easy to get to that it's really just overkill. Every time you draw it, you'd rather it be either another card to get into a Rise Heart, or a card to help protect it. And finally, if a ban list comes around and reduces the numbers of main deck monsters, there are a handful of level 7s in the game that can special summon themselves and maybe help make up for the missing numbers. Of course, Wandering Griffin Rider and Illegal Knight from the Adventure Engine can special summon themselves. Also Mech Knight's Red Moon and Yellow Star. Also the Ascendant of Thunder can special summon itself under any board state at the cost of 3000 life points. And there's also Psybeast, who can't special summon itself, but when it's normal summoned, you can banish a psychic type monster from your deck and it'll copy that monster's level. So it's obviously not as good as the others, but if you're really hurting for level 7s, this could pair okay with the others. And now for the ban list summary. The hits weren't too big, just Unicorn to 2, a Rise Heart to 1, and Diablosis banned. So the obvious effects are that you can't rip from the extra deck or zone lock nearly as much, you have 1 fewer starter, and if your boss gets added you have to expend a few more resources to get it back. But really, that didn't hurt the deck all that much. It's definitely still been the best deck since this ban list. Unicorn to 2 would have hurt the deck a lot more if Raitsoth didn't also mean access to Unicorn, and Terraforming of course means access to Raitsoth. So I really just went from 7 copies of Unicorn to 6, which really isn't that bad at all, even though it does make Droll an even bigger threat to the deck. Also, a Rise Heart is actually super easy to get back. All you need to do is save a Scareclaw cache in hand and set preparations, and you can even get it back on your opponent's turn. And even if you can't get it back, again, the deck can easily put up over 8000 damage with just 1 card without even using the extra deck. So just the fact that they had to expend resources to out a Rise Heart could mean you get to live to turn 3 and then just OTK. For the future, what I think really needs to happen is a Band of Birth. I'm honestly shocked it wasn't at least limited on the first ban list to hit the deck. The fact that if you don't get rid of it, you almost guaranteed lose is wild enough, but one of the most frustrating things in the game is when you do manage to get rid of it and you out the entire board, but you can't quite close the game out, and then they just reveal they had a second one in hand, and you just wasted some of your removal on the first one, and then you lose on the spot. It definitely should be banned, but a limit first would have been nice. Also, a Rise Heart does need to go. It's just way too easy to bring out for how incredibly strong wrong it is. The format is definitely being warped around it having a super easy access macrocosmos, and it's gatekeeping way too many new decks that could be really cool, but they just can't play under that effect. And winning the die roll doesn't even really mean anything in that respect, because they might have just opened Shifter anyway. And that's Kashtira. What do you think of it? Let me know in the comments what you think of the archetype and what you thought of the video too. And of course, if you did like it and you want to see more of this stuff, a like and a subscription would be really appreciated. Personally, I've actually really enjoyed playing Kashtira. I fully understand why a lot of people hate the deck, but I really like Xyz monsters, I like banishing things as a form of removal, and it was kind of nice going from a format where the best deck took a ton of brain power to one where it didn't. But locking zones, especially so many of them, isn't a super healthy game mechanic, and even though the format is a lot more diverse now, having such an easy macrocosmos probably does gatekeep the format a little bit too much, and DIABLOSIS is just absurd. It is pretty wild that they basically just gave that card a whole archetype. Also, I think it makes a pretty cool generic level 7 engine, and I just hope after a banlist there's enough of it left to do that. 7 is definitely one of the undersupported levels in the game, and it's really cool to see that get support. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a nice day.